So for the last 3 weeks, we have touched on some, what I sometimes refer to as the third rail of Messianic Judaism, meaning that there are hot topics that have can have pretty spirited discussions, and unfortunately sometimes if people don't understand, or if they take it the wrong way, or even if people present their views in the wrong way, it can create problems. And I mentioned last week that there were 2 types of questions, easier and hard. The easy ones were when people asked questions on what you just looked over and studied and talked about. The hard ones were when they were outside that. But I'll go to 2 other categories of questions. Sometimes people raise their hand and ask a question because they are seeking information. They want to know something that you might be able to tell them. The other reason is they want their position confirmed. So they'll say something like, I think so-and-so, what do you think? Or, don't you think it ought to be, and that's a little different scenario, which is why we stress on the essentials unity, on the non-essentials liberty, and on all things charity. And I still don't know who said that, but that's all right. The biggest thing is, on all of these subjects, there's not one Messianic Jewish position. There's variations within Messianic Judaism. Like traditional Jewish congregations, in most Messianic congregations, the rabbi will decide how that particular congregation is going to approach these types of issues. And the Messianic rabbi's Jewish upbringing will likely influence their take on these on the way the congregation views how we live out our faith. If they're brought up Reform or secular, kind of like I was, they're going to be a lot more open to various ways of doing things. If they're brought up conservative or orthodox, they might be a little stricter, that it kind of has to be done a certain way. Also, views may, we'll take that. Views may change over time as more information is understood. The way I described it is, hopefully none of us sees everything exactly the way we saw it a year ago. We want to be growing in the Lord. Also, there can be influence from the different Messianic groups that you belong to. We belong to the IAMCS, but there's also the UMJC, the Union of Messianic Jewish Congregations. There's Jews for Jesus congregations. There's Chosen People Ministries, and there's Tikkun. And some of those, the rabbi may come from a charismatic or a non-charismatic background, and that may influence their position on issues, particularly one that we will be talking about in just a moment, which is the operation of the gifts in the congregation, or in modern times. But the first issue we talked about was the role of the Gentile in Messianic Judaism. And scripturally, that's described in Romans 11, verse 11, where it says that they are to provoke the Jewish people to jealousy. And I say that I've always wondered, how do you do that? And I've been in this movement for 40-something years, and been a Jewish believer for over 50, and I really didn't have a good answer. I knew that I'd seen a lot of provoking, but I wasn't sure how you provoke to jealousy. And then I realized at some point a couple of years ago, and this isn't the definitive answer, but all the research I've done, I haven't seen a better one, is when you proclaim that you have belief in the Jewish Messiah, Amen, and that you are serving a Jewish Messiah, that is what has enabled you to be reconciled to your Creator. I believe that a Jewish person is going to say to themselves, well, wait a minute. That's right. If you think he's the Jewish Messiah, how come I don't? That's right. Is that really a valid position? And you never know. A lot of Jewish people have decided to try and disprove that Yeshua is the Jewish Messiah. And most of the one, I don't know of anybody who has successfully disproved it. I know a number of people who have come to faith trying to disprove that. So, and that's why Messianic terminology is so important, to the point that we will be having a class on that sometime soon. But the advantages to Messianic terminology is, one, it makes what we believe, our New Covenant faith, sound like a Jewish thing to believe, as opposed to sounding like something that's not meaningful to them at all. I lamented the fact that even Franklin Graham, at the funeral of Lindsey Graham, with rabbis out there in the audience, said things in a way that a Jewish person wouldn't think it was for them. And his sister, Billy Graham's sister, so it'd be his aunt, was very strong in ministering to the Jewish people. So I'm a little disappointed. It's frustrating to me whenever I see church people that kind of understand the Jewishness of their faith but don't use terminology that gets it across in any way. The second reason is, when you talk to a Jewish person and you say if you say Trinity, they're like, oh, okay, you're Catholic. But if you say triunity, now it's like, what are you talking about? They haven't heard that term before. You have an opportunity to define it before they decide they are. Same thing with Christian. If you say Christian, they figure that means your mother and father are Christians. If you say believer, they may say believer in what? But it's a different, even though it's the same concept, the terminology makes a difference. And that's true in lots of ways. The role of the Gentile is to support the restoration of Israel and doing all they can to see and encourage the salvation of the Jewish people, who we continue to see as God's chosen people. If you mention that on occasion, that'll also get Jewish people's attention. And frequently that's not what they hear if they happen to hear somebody in the church talking, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. Romans 9 verse 4 says all covenants belong to them. And so the covenant relationship that God has established between himself and humanity, the people, other than the universal covenants made with Adam and Noah, are all through the Jewish people, including the final covenant renewal of Jeremiah 31, made with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. That's like saying from A to Z, from top to bottom, from the northern kingdom at the top to the southern kingdom at the bottom, and all parts in between. They're to stand up against anti-Semitism and all forms of replacement theology. And probably the area where there tends to be the most confusion, that's where I have that stuff. Okay, got behind myself and moving stuff around. Well, I have it under they remain God's chosen people. But anyway, we still stand by Paul's statement that the covenants belong to them. Okay, the last one's at the top of the screen. Remain distinct as a Gentile, which simply means one from the nations. And we read 1 Corinthians 7, 18 through 20 last week, with the idea that it says every man is to remain in the calling wherein he was called. And it's talking about circumcision and uncircumcision, representing Jews and Gentiles. And so there's a description that in Ephesians 2 verse 15 that talks about the one new man. And the one new man is Jew and Gentile coming together as one. Well, Gentiles become Jews or Israel or whatever. Then the one new man is Jew and Jew being Jewish. But that's not what happens, because that would not make any sense. So the one new man is where we overcome the cultural differences in the way we were raised and our attitude toward our understanding of Torah. And, this was more for paganism versus the Jewish people. But in the church world, they don't have the greatest understanding of Torah. I think you'll agree with me. And certainly Hebrew scriptures. I was actually talking to a Jewish lady this past weekend, and I called them the Hebrew scriptures, and she goes, you're talking about the Old Testament? That's what you should call it, or that's what Jews call it, or something like that. I said, okay, Old Testament. I said, to me, Old Testament implies a New Testament, but if you want to go with Old Testament, that's what we'll call it from now on. But anyway, most of the prophecies, most of the instructions are thought to be done away with. And like I said, we'll talk about that right now. Because, oh, I do have that. Okay, didn't mark it as being there, but there it is. Okay, the role of Torah in the life of a believer, the Torah or the Mosaic covenant. And I said last week that the official position of most Messianic groups is kind of like the U.S. policy toward Taiwan, strategic ambiguity, meaning that there's no official position from any of those groups that I know of on this subject. And when people talk about keeping Torah, the first thing you find out is you have to define what does keeping Torah mean. First you have to define Torah. And we talked about this last week, so unless there's questions, I'm not going to go over everything we talked about last week. But then you have to define keeping or obligation. And most congregations, most of the organizations see the Jewish people as obligated through their covenant relationship to be obedient to the Lord's instructions. Since some of them are forever instructions, that obedience continues up even until today. And then we talked about the role of the sojourner who may partake in the same way as the Jewish community does it. And we talked about the descriptions and instructions in Numbers chapter 15 and Exodus chapter 12 addressing the sojourner as well as other foreigners in terms of offering sacrifices and including partaking of the Passover lamb. And we saw that the sojourners were included as part of the community if they chose to be. We also addressed in the conversations of the last 3 weeks the role of Jewish tradition in our observances, because instructions regarding the Sabbath and the festivals, in some cases there will be like 3 or 4 verses in the scriptures telling you what to do. Well, the Jewish people do not view these scriptures as theoretical, as well. I wonder, what that really means. They have to decide, how do we turn this into application? How are we going to carry this out? How are we going to make this meaningful? And so frequently that comes from Jewish tradition. Now, we do not go along with traditions that contradict the scriptures. And in some cases, if we think the scripture is clear enough, then we will depart from the Jewish traditional way. And an example of that is the day that we observe first fruits and Shavuot. We do it always on a Sunday, and the Jewish people rarely do it. Only once every 7 years or so will it happen on a Sunday. And another Jewish tradition is keeping kosher. Biblically, you have what we call the dietary laws. Keeping kosher, the rabbis have added milk and meat, which we do not incorporate in our understanding of the dietary laws. But nonetheless, that is something that, as you all know, we continue to believe is meaningful. We even looked at the passage and saw at the end, it says that the reason for all of these animals being declared as clean or unclean is connected to the holiness of the Lord. And then he says, because I am holy, you are to be holy. So it's really tied to holiness, not health. And there's also, it helps Jewish people to maintain a distinction when they're eating different foods, when their choices of foods are different. We also talked about the role of the Talmud. We see it as valid for historical information, but it is not authoritative in terms of theology. It's good. Sometimes it has explanation of Jewish traditions and why we do them, but once again, we do not see it as authoritative, and we rarely cite it as though it is authoritative. We also talked about typical church views. Starts out with the Torah's been done away with. That's followed by the dietary laws being done away with. It's kind of included in that. Many in the church see themselves as Israel, and we talked about some verses where they apply promises to the Jewish people to themselves as individuals. We cited the example of Isaiah 54:17. No weapon formed against you will prosper. 2 Chronicles 7:14, if my people who were called by my name. And Isaiah 41:10, fear not, for I am with thee. Be not afraid, or dismayed, for I am thy God. And in all three of those verses, we saw that if we read them in their context, they're all promises made specifically to the Jewish people. And 2 Chronicles 7:14 was applying to the dedication of the first temple. We mentioned the rabbi's rules of hermeneutics. I'm going to give them to you again. Hermeneutics is a long Greek word that means rules for Bible interpretation. The first thing you have to decide, is it figurative or literal? In John 1 verse 29, John the immerser says, behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. Was he a lamb? Was he baying? Bleeding? Was he bleating? Not bleeding. Did he have wool on the? No, that's a figurative term, and that's just one example. There's lots of them. Is it specific or universal? And I should have cited Joshua 1:8, which people quote all the time. This book of the law shall not. I learned it. And I learned it in verse memory when I first became a believer. And I learned it under assurance of success, for the believer. And it's this book of the law shall not depart out of thy mouth, but thou shalt meditate therein day and night. Then thou shalt make thy way prosperous, and then thou shalt have good success. My little 5-year-old grandson quoted that as his verse when they were quoting Bible verses. That was a verse that was given to Joshua, who was getting ready to lead the Israelites into the promised land. And it was the Lord promising him success if he did what the Lord told him to do. He was taking over the leadership for Moses. That doesn't even apply to the Jewish people in general. It doesn't apply to Jewish people as individuals. It certainly doesn't apply to church people as individuals in the context that it was given. Now, whether or not, you want to say, just as you told Joshua, when the Israelites were entering the promised land, I believe what I'm about to do is in accordance with your will, and I ask you to help me to prosper if I meditate on your word and am obedient to your instructions. You can see if you can attempt to make it apply, to find a universal aspect to it. But the context of the promise is given to Joshua as the leader of the Israelites. Right? Y'all agree with that? Anybody disagree? Okay. And similarly in this situation, but also in Isaiah 41 that I just mentioned, it's directed. You have to determine whether the verses apply individually or as a community. What's the easiest way to tell that? Anybody know? I've mentioned it on a number of occasions. Buy a King James Bible. Because in the King James translation, now if you know Hebrew and Greek, don't bother. You already know how to do it. But if you don't know Hebrew and Greek and don't have access to those original texts, King James Bible will tell you whether the word you, when it uses the word you, it's singular. It's directed to an individual. And when it's talking to a community, it'll say ye. So, for example, here's a verse you probably heard and didn't know said ye. Ephesians 2, verse 8. For by grace ye have been saved through faith. Most people think they're the ye that it's talking about. But if you read Ephesians chapter 2, it's talking about the Gentiles who were once far off being brought near. And by grace, they have all been saved as a group because they're no longer far off. They're no longer estranged from the promises. They're no longer separated from the commonwealth of Israel. But they've been brought into all of this connection to the covenant relationship with the Lord. And that is a statement about the position of the Gentiles. So the next time you hear somebody quote Ephesians 2:8, your little, what's the term I want?
Radar?
Yeah, I was thinking of like Scooby-Doo senses or something, but I can't think of it. It'll come to me. What's it?
Spidey sense.
Yeah, that's it. Spidey sense will...
tingle.
Yes, will tingle. Thank you. All right. It was stirring around back there somewhere, like I said. Okay. And I've added a fourth rule, which is a text without context is a pretext, meaning you can make it say anything you want, and people often do that. We call that proof texting. Another subject we discussed was circumcision, and basically we said that just because a male has been circumcised in the hospital when they're born is not connected to the 8-day circumcision that the scriptures say is when a ceremony is performed where the child is seen as entering into the Abrahamic covenant. Interesting, in that particular covenant, it's not only something the parents do, but they do it with the next generation for them. And then the way the next generation will decide whether or not they're entering into the covenant is whether or not they circumcise their male babies on the 8th day. So, which today, by and large, only the Orthodox and conservative may do. Not likely with the Reform. They may circumcise them, but they probably just have them circumcised at the hospital, like those of you may have well done for your children, because it was a pretty popular thing to do in the 50s through the 70s or 80s or so, and then things have changed. We also talked about calling Messianic Jewish leaders Rabbi. Matthew 23, verse 8 says, "Do not be called Rabbi, for one is your master, even Messiah, and all ye are brethren." Of course, verse 9 says, "For one is your Father which is in heaven." And so Yeshua and the writers of the New Covenant did not get the memo on that one because they use the term Father all the time. But the reality is this isn't, as Janelle pointed out, this isn't talking about terminology for leaders. It was talking about the need for humilities. It was criticizing the Pharisees for the pride and hypocrisy they showed when they went around saying to one another, after having the longest fringes and the longest tefillin wrap and the best seats in the synagogue, and they would go running around and saying, "Oh, Rabbi so-and-so, it's wonderful to see you," and just calling one another Rabbi. And it was a pride thing that Yeshua was speaking against. He also says, "Call no one teacher or leader or instructor," in that same passage in verse 10. So you get the idea on that one. Okay, so those were the areas we covered last week. Any questions on that before we go to... Yes, Jeremy.
So I was wondering, the Torah was given, wasn't it supposed to be a heart issue to bring it to the heart of a person, and so then it'll be more of a choice as how you want to show love and honor to God?
There is that aspect to it, but there's also instructions in the Torah that are about identity and about submission, which we'll talk about more when we get back to 1 Peter, which I'm hoping to do tonight. And so he certainly says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. But right after he said that, you shall talk about it when you sit in your house and when you walk by the way and when you lie down and when you rise up. He wants the heart to be behind it, but sometimes it starts with obedience, particularly when you're younger. The ultimate blessing to the Lord, the ultimate act of worship, is having it be something that you absolutely choose to do. And sometimes the choice comes after the procedure has been instituted, and now you can say, okay, now Messiah Yeshua has come along, and we're no longer afraid of dying if we violate the Torah. So we view it in a different way, and our obedience is now not the same as simply obeying out of fear or out of concern that the community would pick up stones to stone you or something like that. And so, but yeah, the ultimate, of course, and it's described in Jeremiah 31, that the Lord would write his Torah on our hearts. When those words were written on tablets of stone, the tablets got broken, which was symbolic of the people breaking the covenant. And so the Lord allowed them to reestablish the covenant, a second set of tablets. But the ultimate place where his words are the most meaningful is when they're written on our hearts. Jeremiah 31, the prophecy of the new covenant. Okay, so those are two controversial topics we talked about, but why not a third? The only difference between the last two topics we talked about, there's actually a fourth, and I'm the one who talked about the fourth one in 1 Peter. But these are also controversy within the entire body of believers. The first one is the gifts of the Spirit. And the gifts that are usually described or laid out in 1 Corinthians 12, verses 7 through 10. Ironically, I didn't write those down. I didn't copy the verse. Somebody want to turn to that and read it? 1 Corinthians 12, verses 7 through 10. Whoever gets there first, just go ahead and start reading.
This is a race.
All right, I got it.
Okay.
Moreover, to each person is given the particular manifestation of the Spirit that will be for the common good. To me, though the Spirit is given a word, through the Spirit is given a word of wisdom, to another a word of knowledge in accordance with the same Spirit, to another faith by the same Spirit, and to another gifts of healing by the one Spirit, to another the working of miracles, to another prophecy, to another the ability to judge between spirits or discernment, to another the ability to speak in different kinds of tongues, and to yet another the ability to interpret tongues.
Okay, so that just lays out what we're referring to. While we believe that the gifts are functional in the body based on what the scriptures say, even for today, it's hard enough to get pre-believing Jewish people to come to our synagogue. And since these gifts are not part of Jewish belief, that's another reason. They're found only in the New Covenant scriptures, which pre-believing Jewish people likely won't accept as authoritative. And this scenario is actually addressed in 1 Corinthians 14, verse 23, where Paul says, "So if the whole congregation comes together with everybody speaking in tongues, and uninstructed people or unbelievers come in, won't they say, 'You're crazy'?" The gifts are also often misused in the charismatic world. An example of that is that tongues are not supposed to be used in a congregational setting without an interpretation. Here's what Paul writes to the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 14, verses 27 and 28. "If the gift of tongues is exercised, let it be by 2 or at most 3, and each in turn, and let someone interpret. And if there is no one present who can interpret, let the people who speak in tongues keep silent when the congregation meets. They can speak to themselves and to God." Now, at my former congregation, which started out of a charismatic church, the rabbi operated in the gifts. Nonetheless, we would announce, and I think they still do that, if you have a word from the Lord for the congregation, write it down, bring it to someone in leadership, and they will decide if it is to be presented to the congregation. Let everything be done in decency and in order. The spirit of the prophet is subject to the prophet. Anybody else heard a speech like that in a congregation anywhere?
No,
Okay, only one. All right.
it was
2.
because of Rabbi Kevin's mom and dad.
Yes, that's who would say that. Now, but here's another point. The gifts are also encouraged and the verse they're quoting at the end, let's see, I'll wait till the end of this one. Gifts are also encouraged at the national conference. However, the booklet they hand out says, "Use of the prophetic gift. If you believe you've been given a word from the Lord for the conference, please submit it in writing to a member of the MJA Executive Committee so that it may be tested. No prophecy in English or in tongues will be permitted from the floor, so that all may be done in decency and in order. Your cooperation in this is greatly appreciated." And the ending parts of both of those, the decency and in order, comes from 1 Corinthians 14, verse 32, which says, "Also the prophets' spirits are under the prophets' control, for God is not a God of unruliness, but of shalom." Now, just for your information, I mentioned a number of groups that have different views that might influence the position that various congregations within Messianic Judaism might take. The IMCS and Tikkun are primarily charismatic. We belong to the IMCS, the International Alliance of Messianic Congregations and Synagogues. The Tikkun came out of the UMJC came out of the IMCS, and Tikkun came out of the UMJC. The UMJC, the Union of Messianic Jewish Congregations, these days has some charismatic congregations, but also has a number that are not charismatic. Jews for Jesus, Chosen People Ministries, and the Association of Messianic Congregations are all non-charismatic. So there's not one specific Messianic Jewish position on the gifts. And I've told you, given our desire to get Jewish people to come to the congregation, we do not want to see those gifts misused, and we expect that if somebody has a prophecy from the Lord, that if it's in a tongue, there will be an interpretation for it. And frequently, like I said, that's not the case. But here's what Paul writes comparing the gifts to love. You knew this was coming. In 1 Corinthians 13, verses 1 and 2, and I chose the King James translation so you'll hear it with the words you're used to hearing it with. "Though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, and have not agapen, charity, I am become as sounding brass or a tinkling cymbal. And though I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and though I have all faith so that I could remove mountains, and have not agapen, charity or love, I am nothing." So that is just a brief overview of how our congregation approaches the ministry or the application of the gifts in a congregational setting. Any questions that are associated with finding out more information tied to that particular scenario. Rebecca.
When you were at Bethel, were you under Rabbi Solomon?
Yes.
And did you see the gifts of the Spirit then?
Yes, we did see them, but like I said, they were not operating in a congregational setting because they made that announcement at every service. Like I said, I think they still do. So it was practiced in a different way than you tend to see in a lot of charismatic churches. All right, so 3 weeks ago, I know it seems like forever, we were discussing another topic that's controversial, which is the topic of submission. And we find that we're really in the midst of that discussion, or we were just kind of coming to the end of it. It goes from 1 Peter 2, verse 13, through chapter 3, verse 7. And it starts out saying, submit to every human authority. And then it goes on to explain that we may influence them by our good actions. That submission is intended, as one aspect of it, is a testimony. In chapter 2, verse 12 of 1 Peter, it says, amongst the ethnaesin. Did I spell that right? I didn't. Let's see. Yeah, I just put it. And it means nations or Gentiles or pagans. And verse 15 says, with well-doing, you will silence foolish men. And then in 1 Peter 3, the first verses in chapter 3 are talking about wives winning over husbands that are disobedient to the word. In this passage about submission, we're also to submit to the emperor, the ultimate ruling authority, God's representative on the earth in terms of the highest authority in the land. You also had your local authority, the governor. You were supposed to submit to them as well. House servants were to submit to their masters, whether they were good or whether they were harsh toward them. And then it talks about Yeshua's submission. And when it talks about him submitting to the will of the Father, it cites him as an example and says, indeed, this is what you were called to, because the Messiah too suffered on your behalf, leaving an example so that you should follow in his steps. And then after that, it talks about our submission to the Lord. It says in verse 25, let's see if I have it. Yeah. Nope. It says in verse 25, our submission to the Lord, he's described as the shepherd. And actually, in the end of chapter 2, things are being described as they are in Isaiah 53, the role of the suffering servant. And it says, all we like sheep have gone astray. We've turned each and one to his own way. And when Peter's using that passage, he says, but even though we were like sheep, when before we were believers, we can submit to the shepherd, who he describes as the overseer of our souls. And by the way, the Greek word for overseer there is episkopon, which is the term that you get for those who follow the Episcopalian faith. That's just a bit of added information. Verse 25 of 1 Peter 2 says, for you used to be like sheep gone astray, but now you have turned to the shepherd who watches over you, or who is the overseer of your soul, is what it says in the Greek. So we're to submit like he did, and this is what they were called to do. And then that brings us to 1 Peter chapter 3. We've covered the first 7 verses. And it starts out likewise, or in the same manner. And so we have to figure out, if the first word in the Greek means likewise, what is it connecting to? Something that Peter has previously written. But he wrote about servants submitting to their master, whether they are kind or harsh. He wrote about Yeshua's submission, as we just talked about. and he wrote about our submission to the shepherd. And in that context, after he says likewise, he says wives are to submit to their husbands. And let's see. Let me jump back. In terms of submitting to the shepherd as lost sheep, you have the master who may be good or may be harsh in that verse right there, which comes from, I believe, chapter 2, verse 18. When we submit to the shepherd, he is not harsh. We experience grace and unconditional love. So, even though Peter is telling servants that they're to submit to their masters, how much more should we be submitting to a master who only wants to bless us, who is going to show grace to us, who is not harsh towards us in any way? And then, like I said, the instruction is given, wives are to submit to their husbands, and in verse 1, it gives a worst case scenario. Even in the case where a husband is disobedient to the word, this submission may win them over. So it is kind of the way it's being presented. And it's to win them over through a good example when, you really are wanting to be... The flesh never wants to submit. And so even though you're wanting to give all the reasons why you shouldn't, your willingness to submit may win them over. And we saw that earlier with the nations as well in Ephesians chapter 2. Demonstrating respectful and pure behavior, which is described as a display of inner beauty. And it's showing respect to the position that they have as God has established, not because one is better than the other, but he's established a headship role for the husband and the wife. And according to the curse in Genesis 3, that is not going to be the smoothest running operation. There is going to be a desire to resist that authority. And husbands may try to lord it over their wives, and that's going to make the operation run even less smooth. And that's why the husbands are given instructions. Likewise, they are to have understanding towards their wife, who is not as strong as you are, but still deserves honor. And then it says that marriage is a reflection of salvation. That it reflects their coming together as fellow heirs of salvation. When it comes to salvation, there's no difference between the husband and the wife. They're actually described as co-heirs of the grace of life in these verses. And then it says, so that their prayers won't be hindered. And the problem is, it doesn't tell us whether it's talking about the husband and wife or just the husband whose prayers can be hindered. Clearly, the husband has an issue. Whether or not the wife is included, different interpreters come up with different conclusions. And the submission of wives is also described in Ephesians chapter 5, where it starts out saying, once again, it's a passage about submission. And the first thing it says is not, wives, submit to your husbands. It's within a context. And it says, submit to one another in the fear of the Messiah. So the first thing we're supposed to do is submit to one another as believers. Then it says, wives should submit to their husbands as they do to the Lord. That reminds me of something I wanted to say that I kind of forgot about. In that verse where it says that the very first verse about submission in 1 Peter 2:13, it tells why we are to submit. Does anybody remember what it says? I didn't tell you this time, but I did when we went over it. Or you can look it up. It says, for the Lord's sake. And so sometimes we're not submitting because the other person, it's not for their sake, it's for the Lord's sake. We're submitting first to the Lord, and then we submit to the authorities as a result. Here it says, wives should submit to their husbands as they do to the Lord, because the husband is head of the wife, just as Messiah, as head of the Messianic community, is himself the one who keeps the body safe. Just as the Messianic community submits to the Messiah. So once again, we're supposed to, as a community, be submitted to the Messiah. So also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. As for husbands, love your wives, just as the Messiah loves the Messianic community. Indeed, how did he demonstrate his love? He gave himself up on its behalf. So submission is described, once again, as Jeremy asked earlier, in terms of Torah observance. It's to be a choice. It's not a response to a husband's demand. And the world cannot understand that. Whenever the world sees that in the body of believers, wives are told to submit to their husbands, they interpret that as wives must do that. They're being forced to do that against their will, and so they perceive that as something they don't want any part of. But that is not the submission that's described in the Scriptures. And next week we will pick up with verse 8 of 1 Peter. Any questions on the 4 interesting topics that we have managed to cover in the last 2 weeks, which is the role of Gentiles in the Messianic movement, the role of Torah in the life of Messianic believers, the operation of gifts in the congregation, and the instructions to wives to submit their husbands, and what the husbands are told that they're supposed to do in terms of how they are to provide, protect, and take care of their wives. George.
I don't know if this fits exactly, but there's a verse that says, "And despisest thou the riches of his goodness and forbearance and long-suffering, not knowing that the goodness of God leadeth thee to repentance." And if we're God-like and somebody needs correction and like that, the way that we handle that in a loving, kind way is what brings repentance, not being hard and harsh.
Right. The world, the scriptures say, lording it over those that we have responsibility for is something that happens in the pagan world. We're supposed to be different. And I guess that'll come later in 1 Peter 3. If we aren't different from the world, we have no message for them. If we say, hey, we're going to do things just like you do, but you ought to believe this instead, they're kind of like, why? If you're doing exactly what I'm doing, why does the belief make a difference? It doesn't impact what you're doing. But every time, I often point out, the world is watching us to see, do we really live out what we believe? And are we willing to do it even when we don't think anybody is watching? Is it real to us, or is it just something that we, talk a good game about? And so I believe that my greatest testimony in my interactions with the Jewish people, including family and friends, is that I'm not the way I was before. Amen. And when they descend into the gutter in language or even in crudeness, I don't go with them. Mm-hmm. That I manage to stay, not because I'm any better than they are, but my God is something that should enable me to withstand the temptation to fit in rather than stand out, Amen. To overcome the flesh's desire to be one of the group or to go along to get along. And so I believe that is a very strong testimony. And my message there is, you have a testimony even when your mouth is closed. and it may be stronger than your testimony when your mouth is open.